Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sunday session. It is the 28th of September 2025, and in the studio we have some scientists this week. Hey, there you go, Kris. We've been struggling, so we're a bit late because Kris has been struggling with getting any visual, but we're all here, definitely spiritually. Okay, so we'll just go around and introduce people. I'm not sure where you all are. I'm just going to say where I think you are, and then you need to correct me. So we've got Phil Mulvey. His business is Ryzo, and he should be in Australia, I think. So good morning, Phil. And then we've got Kris Nichols, who is Knowledge of Regeneration in Soil. So that's abbreviated as Kris. So welcome, Kris. I'm presuming you are in America somewhere.
Yes, I'm in Upper Midwest in Minnesota.
Lovely. Welcome to the Sunday session. And of course, the usual suspect, Kevin Elmy from Cover Crops Canada I'm presuming you are in Alberta.
Yep, still in Alberta today.
Okay, good, because he travels around a fair bit. Welcome to all of our viewers. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, I need to just make sure everybody knows that my internet is really, really terrible. So what will happen is the people in the studio, you guys will just continue the conversation, even if I'm pulling a funny face and I'm frozen, okay? Because last session I was something like this. All right, but you guys carried on talking, so that was brilliant. So you just pick up the slack and I'll just chip in whenever I can, whenever my internet's okay. The other thing I want to say is I want to really reiterate that this is not, in capital letters, NOT, about climate change, all right? But it's very difficult to talk about carbon and water cycles without mentioning climate at some stage. What I think we should do, for those people who are not familiar with Phil Mulvey and Kris Nichols, if both Phil and Kris, you can give a brief introduction of who you are and what you've been doing in your life and how you've come to this point of regeneration. That would be fantastic. 5-10 minutes. Shall we go ladies first? Kris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Kris Nichols. I consider myself to be a soil microbiologist. My doctorate was in soil science and my master's degree was in environmental microbiology. But the most important thing to know about me is I fell in love with a fungus, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, when I was 19 years old. And I'm still enamored and in love with that fungus, but also with how the whole entire soil system is working together. And I think that's what really excites me about regenerative agriculture. And I think of it as basically regenerating the soil. That's what it is that we're trying to do. So I love working with farmers and ranchers and consumers, just pretty much everybody, on how we can join together to regenerate the soil. And, from this standpoint, the discussion we're having today on talking about water and carbon cycles, I think there's basically one cycle that controls them all, or like one ring that controls them all, and that's the carbon cycle. And so water, nutrients, everything else is dependent and integrated within that water cycle.
Fantastic. And how did you actually get to this point, Kris?
Well, I worked for a while for the U.S. federal government through the Agricultural Research Service as a research scientist. I worked within the organic nonprofit industry for a while, and I basically come from a farming background. My dad farms in southwestern Minnesota, and my family's been involved in multiple generations of farming and agriculture. So I've kind of, it is my life. I've been a part of this all of my life. And, I'm really, really wanting to see for my grandnieces and my grandnephew what the future is going to look like in food production, food security, food quality, and at the same time, how that is going to be able to address what's happening in our entire environment as we look at the systems as a whole.
Absolutely. And Phil, what about you?
I've had a slightly different pathway to Kris. I've now been 48 years studying soil, so it's a long time. So I did a Bachelor of Science of Agriculture with a Master's in Environmental Geology and Hydrogeology. Tried a PhD 3 times and never quite got it completed of 3 different subjects. So I'm a sucker for, I think, failure is one way of putting it. I tried to see if farmers were interested in independent soil advice in Australia in 79 to 81 and couldn't really make a go of it. No one was greatly interested because advice was free through the departments or the fertilizer companies who needlessly kept on saying put more on. And as a result, I went into mine rehab and building a stable soil on a tailings dam or on waste rock dumps actually involves vast amounts of organic matter and trying to get living matter, the microbes particularly, into the system. So somewhere along the line, ended up employing a few people, and then we got into mine closure. So we closed quite a few uranium mines and then moved into contaminated sites and acid sulfate soils and landfills and the like. And before I knew it, we had a lot of people working for us. And they all came from an ag background, and a lot of them said of the great millennial drought that our family back home would like to know how to fix the land. And we've got a job fixing the land, Phil, and we work for you. So can you come and start talking to farmers again? So that went down a different route. But so we went back on bringing our rehab knowledge to the farm. But we didn't know anything about farm systems. So at the first presentation, I went along in 2001 to a whole bunch of farmers, and I actually think one of those farmers was a well-known Australian called Charles Massey in the field. Anyway, I actually, when I went down, I could see that the problem was, maintaining a living phase and organic matter. So I actually said, look, I know what the answer is, but I don't know how to make you green while keeping you in the black. And so that became a journey that we then invested in a whole of farm systems agriculture consultancy, because we were environmental consultancy. And we had a contracting arm, a research arm, and a software arm. So we were a reasonable size entity in the soils game in Australia and overseas. And the outcome of that became Ryzo, which is fundamentally a regenerative agriculture software and consulting group. So that's sort of my background. I'm a townie, which in Australian terms means you come from a country town that services agriculture. So I wasn't actually off the farm per se, but I come from that background. So that's where I sit.
Fantastic. Thank you, Phil. Kevin, would you just like to give a brief one? I know some people, the usual people listening will know who you are, but just in case if we've got any newbies on.
Having these two as guests, I think our followership is going to spike a little higher than normal. So basically, I was raised on a pedigree seed farm in eastern Saskatchewan. Have my degree in ag from the University of Saskatchewan, and had numerous jobs through Western Canada. Moved back to the farm in 1999 when I bought some land, which I ended up buying dirt, not soil. So went on my journey of, okay, so how do I get these soils functioning? And so I want to build organic matter, which guess what? That got me down the carbon route. So from there, I was introduced to cover cropping in 2007, and wasn't getting the number of species that I needed. So then I was introduced to Steve Groff, started Cover Crops Canada, and from there started, going out and talking to people. One of the first speakers that I had the aha moment was Dr. Kris Nichols at an organic conference in Regina. Then later in the winter, it was Dr. Jill Clapperton. And from there, my head was just spinning and couldn't get back into the field, getting these green plants growing as fast as I want. So from there, sold the farm in 2021, and I've been full-time coaching and educating through Western Canada. Spent a year in Australia, and this last summer spent 3 weeks in Ukraine, touring through and looking at different fields there. So that's where I'm at. And
then next year, where are you going?
Back to WA, and there's some conferences going on in March of 2026 that I think I might show up to.
Good job. Hopefully you will. Well, thank you all in the studio for introducing yourself. And I like to dabble with different things, although there's sort of a semi-structure here. But what I'd like to do for all of you is to put out the question of, what does climate change mean to you? Just the first thing that pops into your mind, because I'm hoping that it will actually help with the language session and then with what we're actually discussing for the rest of the time. So Kevin, what does climate change mean to you? Just in a couple of words.
That's a really good question, because these trends that we're getting, things are changing. Why? Is it a natural occurrence? What's going on? So it's just by statistically speaking, it is the moving number of where we are on what the average is. And I was out fishing today, end of September for Western Alberta, and it was 20 degrees outside. Beautiful day. Whereas normally, we've had hard frost by now. Things have senesced. Half the leaves are still green on the trees. So interesting.
And Kris, what does climate change mean to you?
Climate change to me means that we are going to have to work even harder to work with the entire system in order to be able to, I think, utilize some of the options and opportunities that are in front of us to actually increase photosynthetic activity. I've been up in Alberta. I'm going to be up near the Yukon here at the end of October, and when we're having these discussions, and I'm going to be in a soil pit. If you want to show that picture of me in the soil pit, just really quickly, that was actually up in Alberta. And as we look at what's going on, I very much expect that I can be up by the Yukon towards the end of October, and we're going to be digging soil pits, and we're going to be out there, just in some of our light jackets and not really needing our puffies, because we, are having these warmer temperatures, as Kevin mentioned. But I see these as options and opportunities for, again, us to really start working more with the carbon cycle and its impacts on the water cycle, so that we are able to actually increase the number of days in which we're having photosynthetic activity and putting carbon below ground, and also trying to increase photosynthetic rates to increase carbon going below ground. This is really what it is that we need to do, is really regenerate the soil, and the only way that's going to happen is getting carbon going below ground.
And Phil? I don't know.
Yeah, look, I agree with Kris that climate change is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to know your landscape so you can manage your local climate better. And a lot of that comes from managing heat on your land, and managing, because the heat is what no one talks about it because CO2 is the blanket, really. And so managing the source of the heat is really important. And as Kris just indicated, you manage the heat in our land by organic matter and cover. And hopefully we'll go in more to it later. But the bottom line from my perspective is if you're not managing water on your landscape, and you do that by a variety of means, but the key one is carbon in soil and living matter. If you're not managing water on your landscape, you are not optimizing your future and greatly increasing the resilience of your land and your community. And that's where it all comes from is climate change, or anthropogenic climate change is an opportunity for all land managers around the world, and we see it as a disaster, and I see it that's the wrong story. It's a great opportunity.
Wow. Okay. Actually blown away by those answers. Oh yes, plug your book, Phil.
Oh yeah, well, thank you, Kevin. It is now available as an ebook on. It used to be, but the second edition we took the first edition down, so it's only come back as an ebook, even though it's been out since 2023, the second edition. So, I was so concerned. Well, my daughter actually pushed me back in about 2018 to set down why I got upset about the climate change debate. And I got upset because as a scientist, I dislike what is effectively misinformation. And around the world, the misinformation was going out that if you stop emissions, you reverse climate change. And I just knew that was wrong. And there was a vast number of people on hydrologists and geology and soil science point of view that also knew that was wrong, but no one was game to stick their head up above the parapet because it got lopped off, particularly the researchers. So the bottom line is the book just sets out this two things that the world, effectively two things that's done with once solar radiation gets through the clouds. And one is to convert the heat, and the other is to refract the heat or change the heat, which is then reflected by the clouds. And so that blanket, if you increase the greenhouse gases, one of which is the major one is water, but if you increase the greenhouse gases, you increase the thickness of the blanket. But no one was talking about, hang on, we've had 300 years changing the way the Earth handles incoming solar radiation, which is what the heat's all about. No one was talking about it. And the data was crystal clear. So I set about just pulling the data of others, not my work, and just writing it. I had the benefit of working in the Middle East a lot, and you could actually see raindrops evaporate as they went past your eyes. And so the water never hit the ground. And I was there after the war in rehabilitating land in Kuwait, and the advantage of seeing that degraded land and seeing the impact on heat was simply amazing. And so that sort of resulted in me just talking about the family and going home just so annoyed when I was watching the news that my daughter, who's a lawyer, said, "Shut up, Dad, write a book and influence policy." So that's how it came about. She wrote the law, I wrote the science, and then she made my science digestible.
Okay, so just I have just typed it, Kris, but pop that in the main chat so that everybody can see it, including the people watching, because that's just a private chat between us in the studio. Phil, thank you so much for leading on to that. I love these discussions on a Sunday because there is no there's pre-planning up to a certain point where I get the photos, but what comes out of people's mouths, it's not scripted, it's just pure dynamite on the day. Because after all of you had talked about what climate change meant to you, I'm going to throw the biggest spanner in the works ever, because Phil's just softened or shrunk that spanner a little bit, because the first thing that comes into my mind when somebody says climate change, I switch off immediately because all I think about is brainwashing and mental manipulation. And the reason why is what I will be doing is leading into the language session, and it's talking about changing climate. So for me personally, this is my perspective, and I'm glad that Phil has sort of helped back it up a little bit. It's a political term that has been overused to dictate to us and in some form brainwash us into thinking about how we have to change our ways. And it's not necessarily for the greater good. So the example is this whole green energy. There's huge deforestation and destruction of our habitats with extraction of metals. And we know what extraction is. It's a linear way of thinking. It's not regeneration, it's extraction. It's completely the opposite. And then there's the obliteration of bush or forests for wind turbines, and then prime agricultural land for solar panels. So when you're using the term climate change, it's really polarizing for me, and a lot of just average people, they're switching off to it because it's been so politicized. So what I'd like to do is just to give the definitions of, there's two different types of climate. So the reason why climate change has been so politicized is because it's talking about the weather conditions prevailing in an area in general or over a long period of time. So that's all they're talking about is the weather. The one that I like to talk about is the prevailing trend of public opinion or of another aspect to life. So you can say, oh, the climate in that room was a little bit aggro or was a really happy climate. So you're using the climate not specifically for weather, about how it feels. And those are the things that you can actually change. So what's happening is the politicians and lobbyists and people like that are putting a huge emphasis on something that we really can't do much about to a certain degree. But I'll come to, and you guys are going, yes, you can. So I'll just go into the definition of a changing climate is where things and people around us are changing. The norm has shifted, which is what Phil just mentioned. Things are not what they used to be. Perceptions have changed, not perspective, perceptions. What was once acceptable is now causing friction. So as soon as you mention climate change, you'll have the naysayers, and then you'll have the ones that are going completely on the other end of the spectrum, like they're overdoing it with talking about batteries and being that's a good change to have. So I just then thought, well, what was detrimental to the changing climate back then in the day when we stepped into the industrial farming, and what we were fed and what we were brainwashed into thinking is we need to feed the world. Well, we produce so much food that we could feed the world, but it's the logistics of it. So then I thought, oh, well, let's look at the beneficial side where we're at now in this changing climate. And we're focusing on improving the soil. And it's boosting regenerative farming, also known as multi-species farming. And so what used to be looked at, even in the 8 years that I've been in this regenerative space, if you want to call it that, is that it used to be sort of a very, almost a negative word. It's like, are you regenerative or are you degenerative? Whereas now it's actually exposing the truth that regeneration needs to happen. We don't need to feed the world, because if you're looking at broadacre farming, it's not really producing food, is it? It's producing commodities. And what are those commodities doing? When you're talking in Australia about growing wheat and sorghum, and then you're talking in America about growing corn, which is maize, and soy, what's that actually doing? Is that feeding the world's population? So it's just analyzing the way that we use these words and understanding that climate is not just discussing weather, it's also discussing the prevailing trend of public opinion. So I thought I'd open it all up to that. Now, my bold statement, and because I just want to get these scientists really thinking and giving us some intellectual conversation, which I know they will. So I've got two bold statements after that affecting both of the different climates. So my first one is our number one factor affecting our climate is bare ground. So that's talking about the weather. And then the other one is our number one factor affecting our climate in our lives is bureaucracy and lobbyists. That's what I believe from my perspective. So open it up to the panel. Who wants to go first?
Well, I don't mind going first and just expand a little bit, because I think it's important the concepts of latent and sensible heat are understood, so that people have a little bit of a background behind why water and carbon are so important, or even looking at it very slightly another way. Just going with the boiling water example, most people fail to understand these physics terms, and they're difficult terms to get because they deal with the different types of energy. So solar radiation comes in, and it's not directly heat, it's radiation, but how our body responds to that radiation either becomes heat or isn't. So what happens is you get the sun coming in, you get a portion reflected off the clouds back, and that's the albedo effect, which we won't talk about. But that penetrates through the cloud, 95% of it gets converted to one or two things. Surprising enough, only 0.5% goes to photosynthesis. So we can actually improve that. That would be amazing. 4.5% gets sort of lost deep into the earth. But the 95% does one of two things. The first thing is it's converted by the land to evapotranspiration. So you're changing from one state to another. You're changing from liquid to gas. And that actually is defined as latent heat. So you can move from solid to liquid. And as you do that, or liquid to gas, you consume heat. The reverse gives off heat, but when you're doing it high up in the atmosphere, a portion of that heat goes into space. So that's one way how heat's lost, is actually converting the vapor back to liquid high up, and we lose some heat off into the space. So the next thing that happens is if you don't have evapotranspiration, if you're not changing the state of a compound or an element, then what you're doing is you're agitating the atoms. And the atoms get very excited. They take the energy in, they can't release it, they're vibrating. They're like what I call Inspector Gadget. He's out there and they're pushing out those connections, and they're vibrating, but they can't push them very far. So once you turn that inputting heat off, you end up giving off what's called infrared. So a good way to look at it is if you boil water in a saucepan and you record the heat, and with one of those temperature guns, the temperature will be subject, if you're at sea level, will be 100 degrees Celsius. And it'll keep at that temperature till the water's gone. As you burn the water off now, and you're burning, and let's assume it's an iron saucepan. So you're putting the heat in the iron saucepan. Once the water's gone, the temperature comes up quite rapidly. You can feel some of the heat coming off it, and that heat you can feel is infrared. It actually goes red at 500 degrees, so it's dropped down into the red spectrum. And it'll keep rising to 1100, at which point the saucepan melts. And when it melts, it stabilizes at that temperature. If you've been out in a tar road, a bitumen road, during a very hot day, past 40 degrees, and you walk across the bitumen compared to the very bare ground, the bitumen's slightly cooler, because people think, oh yeah, it's going to be really hot in the bare ground. But they did this community project for school kids where they were, straight after COVID, there was all these spare temperature guns around. So on a very hot day, it was running about 40 degrees. The kids went out and recorded the temperature over grass, the temperature on artificial grass, the temperature over bitumen, and the temperature in the air. So the temperature in the air was 40 degrees. Overgrass was 25, evapotranspiration is cooling it. On the bare ground, it was roughly 55 to 60. On the bitumen, it was 35. It was actually less than the air temperature because the bitumen was melting. So there you see the two changes of state involved in what's happening. So by able to have evapotranspiration, you do two things. You buffer the soil's temperature. So that means it's warmer during winter, which means you've got a longer growing season, and it's cooler during summer. So that's to do with what's happening with the water that falls. There's a lot more else going on, but just simply saying is that you're dealing with latent heat, evaporating water, or you're heating the land. And at no point has that actually been discussed. So if you look briefly at Australia, so in Australia, if we were to reduce our emissions to zero and stop the methane rumen coming out of the rumen to also zero, imagine we could do that. But if we were to do that, that reduction would represent less than 0.5% of reduction emissions on the world. But Australia is 30% of the continental mass of the Southern Hemisphere. And we have a huge impact on the climate of the Southern Hemisphere, on how we pull wind in by the heat of our land, and how we control because the absence of mountains, how we actually control our rainfall. So if we were to modify how the water falls on our land, two things happen. One is that we actually completely change the results of the three oceans around us. Because we do that, we actually change the climate of the Southern Hemisphere. And that's what's been happening over the last 30 to 40 years, is we forced the cold fronts that bring our winter rain, we forced them further down because our land is too hot. So we're completely focusing on the wrong thing from Australia's perspective. Reducing emissions from Australia won't have a substantive effect worldwide. It'll have a very, very minor effect. But changing how we manage our land, particularly our carbon and our living soil, is actually the greatest thing Australia can do, and right around the world, because it just has a huge impact on climate. I'll hand to the other speakers because there's a lot I can go on about that, but I think the key thing is that it connects to us as land managers on the fact that we can have a big impact, not just on the global climate, but in actual fact, very locally as well. And it can improve our profitability if we hold water at source. And the way to start with all that's actually to do with how we manage our carbon and our cover. So I pass to Kevin and Kris.
So if I could, go ahead. No,
go ahead.
Well,
I was just going to bring it back to my bold statement, so that you are saying then that number one factor is the bare ground, that we have that control over the bare ground, or preventing it. Cool. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, I guess I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a bold statement. I think that is a fact, and we just have to go along with it. It is that we need to, again, as I said before, our biggest thing we need to do is get more photosynthesis occurring, and bare ground is not photosynthesis. So how is it that we're going to be doing that? And kind of going along with some of these, options and opportunities with climate change is, finding new plants and new microbes, and in some cases also utilizing things like microalgae and other microbes that are adapting to the environment and helping to cover that surface so that we're not having bare ground. I've worked in desert ecosystems, and where we are trying to do a number of different things to be able to really try and get that photosynthetic activity going and building up the organic matter in our soils. And I think, that Phil too sort of brought up a good point in us understanding a lot about what's really happening as far as the issues with climate change and how those radiative forces are changing how molecules are interacting and what's going on in that environment. And, there are some scary things that we're looking at where, are we getting to the place where, at some temperatures, we can't exist. Many biological organisms can't exist at certain temperatures. It doesn't mean that all life is going to be wiped off of those surfaces, but we're certainly going to have to look at, how we may be able to live within that environment. And, in being able to take a look at that, I think the other thing that when we think about bare ground and we think about carbon and photosynthesis and water is we end up paying a lot of attention to liquid water that we can see. And I think part of it is because I'm a microbiologist, I pay a lot of attention to things that we can't see. And so my whole life is about stuff that we can't see, and we don't fully understand all of the chemistries that may be going on. But what we are seeing in the end is how the system is functioning. And so there's a lot that has been designed within the system for the system for the plants and the animals to utilize not just here, as you see, the water that we can see, but the things that we can't see, and utilizing that water vapor. We talk a lot about that in forested ecosystems, but we don't think about it in dryland ecosystems and in arid and semi-arid environments. It is about the water that comes from the respiration of the microbial activity and from the respiration of the roots. And so if we can start optimizing all of those efficiencies where we have the ability not just for water to flow into the soil, but again, water vapor to flow out of the soil, that respiration, and get into the plant canopy and help to trigger more photosynthesis and trigger more of those activities that are happening to be able to keep that cycle flowing. I think one, you get benefits from that from a plant growth and photosynthesis and animal growth. But you're also, when we're working a lot more with water vapor, we get a lot with evaporative cooling that's happening as well, as water is changing the state from liquid to gas. And those are things that the system is trying to optimize in what it is that we're doing. And so oftentimes we focus in on these issues with climate change and what's happening with the radiative forcing that we're seeing. But how can we go back to utilizing this to actually help us to optimize those basics that are involved in photosynthesis and that are involved in helping with natural cooling within these systems? It may be that we need to look to different microbes and different plants and different animals to be a part of the system, but it doesn't mean that we're completely defeated in what it is we're trying to do.
Kevin.
Oh, this is great listening to these two go on because once again, just sit back, be a sponge, and absorb their knowledge and experience. But that was once again the aha moment of, okay, so we have to increase photosynthetic activity, efficiency. How do we do that? Green plants. And as I'm driving around the countryside, and I'm sure Dr. Nichols and Dr. Mulvey would agree that we're driving around and we see a bunch of dead plants, at this time of year. And when I was I spent the day with Christine Smith. We were up on top of one of the hills in WA, and I asked her, I said, okay, so I'm looking out the countryside, I see green where the lowland is. And so those are trees, but there was a green square out in the middle of nowhere. And I said, so what's that? And they said, well, that's lucerne. I said, so it's green, nothing else is green except trees. Why don't more people do that? And, well, we don't do that. So it's breaking down some of these mental barriers, saying, why can't we do it? Well, we don't. Well, how do we get more photosynthetic activity happening? Green plants. And driving today, I drove for 2 hours, and I saw a couple of fields that had some green out there, and there was cows out grazing on it, so that was good. But besides that, it was a bunch of dead plants, mature plants that are, whether they're harvested or not harvested, they're not doing their thing to get our carbon cycle functioning in those situations.
So do you think then that it's because they're green that farmers are thinking, oh, they're extracting rather than putting back?
We've been, and as a professional agrologist, through university, we've been told that any time we're getting growth this time of year, it's taking away from next year's crop. Wow. And it's really interesting from the standpoint of, when we have these green living plants and we have the increased soil aggregation stability, we have the better infiltration, and we're taking the extraction methodology of, okay, so we're taking out water so it'll never come back. Well, for us, we're lucky we get snow, and I'm sure Kris will have a little bit of snow in Minnesota too. But this water infiltration, how much evaporation are we getting from bare soil? That is something that is not talked about in our systems. So having, this little green plant growing out in this time of year, waterproofing or weatherproofing our soil aggregates, so that when we go through our winter and we go through the freeze thaw cycles, now those soil aggregates are more stable. Now these microbes aren't starting from ground zero again. We're actually going out, and we can actually start on level 2, level 3. And the picture here is, one of the examples when I went to a producer's field, they were complaining about, once again, you can see the growth underneath these soil clods that I have, not very impressive. And so the soil that is underneath that is on the left. That is high tillage, the carbon through years of traditional management. And once again, best management practices, and it's not because they are the best, it's just at the time we consider them the best. So lots of tillage to control weeds, because weeds are the enemy. We have to do all this tillage. Well, where did the carbon go on the left? The carbon went out, and so did the moisture. I went a couple of meters over to the fence line, and you can see the soil on the right, darker color, better aggregation. There's actually some moisture there, and the native grasses, the brome grass, was chest high, and it was a functioning system. And how much tillage did that fence line get? Zero. How much fertilizer did it get? Zero. How much diversity did it have? Way more diverse. And so these are the things we have to be looking at. And when we start getting the diversity, we have the living plant, we have the root exudates, we have the soil biology, we've captured the water, we've cycled the water. Now these soils start functioning like they should.
It continues to fascinate me. Sorry, I just, and seeing those pictures from Kevin, and it continues to fascinate me. And I apologize. I'll send a copy of some of these pictures. I didn't get them sent to you, but I was just thinking this. What fascinates me is how much the biological system and these organisms that have been around for hundreds of millions of years have been adapting to and creating this environment that they're currently growing in, and adapting as that environment has changed. And so, for example, talking about mycorrhizal fungi, some of the ways that they like to protect themselves from either too cold or too hot temperatures is protecting themselves inside soil aggregates, but also inside the roots of the plants. In some very cold environments, you don't always get the same levels of sporulation by the mycorrhizal fungi that you'll find in more temperate environments, because of the fact that they don't want to put energy into creating a spore. Instead, they're going to put more of their structure inside the roots, because the roots provide an insulation in and of itself. And so the pictures that I wish I would have shared, and I'll send to you, are pictures that actually I took from some soil cores we collected in Alberta, in really sandy soil in southern Alberta. And it was on February 22nd. It had been a very open winter, so there wasn't a lot of snow cover. There wasn't a lot of moisture. And what we found is that there was some volunteer seed that was germinating on February 22nd in Alberta. Normally, that wouldn't be a time in which plants should be growing, or so they say they shouldn't be growing. But the plant had actually, the seed had germinated and was growing through the root and the residue left behind by another plant that had been growing there last year. So the seed had actually germinated inside that protective residue, and then it was growing through the root of the old plant that was there. And so again, as I've said, what really fascinates me is just how much life will try and find a way. And this is what I think we as farmers and ranchers need to be thinking about with our options and opportunities, is how can we set out a platform for life to find a way? We need to kind of almost get out of the way and let it happen. But there are some things that we could do to help to stimulate that. And many of them are, the things that are almost like getting out of the way, letting volunteer plants grow. And what Kevin was talking about, for a very long time, it was policy in the semi-arid environments in the US and Canada, where you had to have a fallow period, and it was required for farmers and ranchers to have fallow periods where you couldn't grow anything during that period because you needed to save moisture. And we've become so obsessed, as you were saying, in if there's something green and growing, it's going to steal something from our crop plant. But we don't think about how the system actually works to actually have those things that are green and growing that are supporting the below ground ecosystem that will then help to stimulate activities going forward. So it's you can't have, I was in California several years ago when they were having a major drought period. And I basically said that if you wanted the solution to a drought is to plant something. That is what it is that we need to do, is have something growing. That's the way we're going to be able, we have to grow our way out of this. And that's all over the world, not just in California and in Alberta, but in Australia and in the Middle East. Everywhere that we are, getting something growing is how we're going to be able to solve the issues that we see.
Can I pick up on a couple of points, Kris? Because I think they're great ones.
Please.
So the first one I'd like to pick up on is both green and growing, and the second one is putting energy into waste activities, in case I get lost during my talk, because I think they're really great points to pick up on. Could you bring up slide 2, Tamzin? Because people, when we talk about climate change, that wasn't quite the one I meant, but yeah, that's beautiful. When we talk about climate change, people think, it's about CO2 lifting the temperature and melting the glaciers and the ice, and that causes sea level rise. The really interesting thing is that approximately 60% of sea level rise has got nothing to do with the CO2 effects. So the CO2 effects have two impacts. One is it is a thermal expansion of the sea, and the other is the melting of the ice, and that counts for about, those two together, about 40%. The other 60%, and it's been well known for a while, but a recent article came out again confirming it, is that it's actually due to water coming off the land and groundwater being pumped. And some of the aquifers in Southern California have lowered the land by in excess of 120 feet, putting it in US parlance, which is in the range of sort of 35 meters. And the land has dropped because the water's been pumped. But the main loss is actually represented by this shot here, which is really, really interesting, is that Australia is the only place in the world that has a centre draining continent. And so we have a huge impact on sea level change and diurnal changes of CO2, surprising enough, due to centre drainage. But the only time in the last 20 years that sea level's gone up was 2020 and 2021, when Australia's Lake Eyre flooded. And it took quite a number of years for that water to be evaporated and get back out into the sea. So we had a circumstance where instead of the sea level rise, sorry, the other way around, the sea level went down, was 2020 and 2021. So then I looked at the data associated with how often Lake Eyre fills. And so Lake Eyre is this huge lake in the centre of Australia that dries out and forms salt. So for 100 years, there was only 8 fillings. And I remember being very excited as a kid when it filled in 1972 to 73, having not filled for 50 years previous. Since 1984, it's actually filled 11 times. And that means that we've got way more runoff from the land. And if we're getting way more runoff from the land, the data's there very strongly, is we are actually getting greater floods for less amount of rainfall. And the major one of this is looking at the area around Manildra, where the town of Eugowra got flooded, where it was only the 6th or 7th biggest rainfall event, but it was the largest flash flood they'd ever had. And they moved from mostly mixed farming to mostly cropping, and cropping with leaving stubble up, not with green cover. So when you have an aspect where it's not in the plant's interest to put energy into wasted activity, so picking up very much what Kris said, is why would they continue to put out, to stimulate the fungi to release different glues, of which glomalin is one, to cause aggregation, if they're not being, if they don't need to chase that water or chase that N or chase that P, and in the US chase the K, and we have a different issues between the US and Australia, whereas we're phosphate deficient, and because of the minerals in the US being illite, they sorbs potassium and don't release it unless they're fungally stimulated. So you have a situation where, why would the plant waste energy? Why would the bacteria waste energy, or feeding the fungi? So that means your aggregation ceases under a fertilised system. If your aggregation ceases, that means the organic matter in the soil drops. That means your infiltration reduces, your capacity to store water reduces, so you don't become drought resistant with your plant. You get much more runoff, way less infiltration. So you end up with a circumstance. And if you go to slide 4, please. Now, I feel Kris has given me permission by talking about mycorrhizal fungi to jump into a bit of physics here. So I'll take that as permission. People find this diagram very confusing, but I find it totally fascinating because it explains a little bit about it explains a lot about what fungi do in regard to changing plant available water. So for the listeners, PF is a really funny term. If you think of pH being the negative log of hydrogen activity, So a negative log is something where the number goes up by 1 unit for every 10 units that it goes down in reverse. So it's hard to get your head round. But very simply, along the bottom is the porosity of the soil filled by water or air. In this instance, it's water. And on the left, you've got two terms, one being FC, which is field capacity, and the other being wilting point. So wilting point is approximately what's called minus 15,000 millibar. So that's roughly a negative log of 4.2. And field capacity typically occurs somewhere around 100. It varies on your soils. So we just got to take it a little bit as that's what it means. So when you look at the orange curve, you're seeing the fact that you've only got 6% of your water that hits the ground is actually available to the plant, because 32% just washes straight through. So that's what's below field capacity. That means it drains away. So when you look over at a clay, you've got 28% beyond field capacity that the plant can't suck enough to get to it. Only 4% drains away, and 17% is available for the plant. So you say that's pretty good. Now, surprising enough, what fungi do and the process they do in putting the glues out is they're encouraged by the bacteria and the root, which feeds them the energy they need, to actually create a space for them to get to the minerals. And to do that, and to create a home for themselves. And to do that, they build a house, or they build pathways and corridors through, so they have to aggregate. So whether it's the sand, which they pull together and aggregate to hold water to make it more humid for them, or whether it's in the clay where they build aggregates to be able to get through and have the root get through so they can feed the bacteria and feed themselves, the net effect is they aggregate. So if you're looking at aggregation, so that organic loam, that green curve, we now take that of the water that's provided by the rain, effectively 80% becomes available in that range called plant available water between wilting point and field capacity. Whereas previously in sand, it was less than 6%, and in clay, it was about 17%. So the benefit of having a diverse rhizosphere and free-living fungi and bacteria, and 70% of nitrogen fixers are free-living, but to have that scenario from diversity of plants that cause that stimulation, then the plants will waste the energy because they're able to get more water and more nutrient. But if you feed them, they won't. So in actual fact, having diversity and being able to feed via the biome, the plants aren't wasting energy because they're going to get more water and they got to go and chase those nutrients. You end up storing more water, having less runoff, because more goes in during infiltration, more goes in and more can be stored. And there's lots of papers out there that say that if you increase your organic matter, you don't increase total water, which is true. If you look down the bottom, the volume percent water hasn't greatly changed. But when farmers talk about total water, they mean plant available water. When scientists talk about total water, they mean the maximum amount of water stored in the porosity. So the language is different between farmers and scientists. Farmers are right. More plant available water stored as organic matter goes up. And that is, the plants aren't wasting energy. So if you're green and growing and you got diversity, you actually completely change the relationship of water in your landscape. You reduce floods to the benefit of your community. You reduce the sea level rise because you're holding it in the sponge. I can talk a lot more about mid-slope and alluvium, but the start is to actually hold it. And to go what Kris says is plants won't waste energy, and nor will bacteria. And fungi need to be fed energy. If you look at everything to do with fungi, and Kris will probably tell me I'm completely wrong, but from I see it, when I work with fungi don't live alone. They live in communities that require them to be fed. So whether you're talking about lichen, or whether you're talking about saprophytic fungi, they still need to be fed. And that means they have to work in communities. But those communities want the benefit of fungi, otherwise they're not going to waste energy feeding them. That relationship is just amazing. It has a huge impact on the physics of the landscape. And we haven't even got to what it does with clouds.
Well, I think if I could just really quick, I didn't mention it, but my mycorrhizal life was also very much impacted on by glomalin and understanding soil aggregation. It was what I did my graduate work on. And I think, what you're saying there is incredibly important because at my defense for my doctorate, that was a big part that the committee had was I was studying glomalin. And one of the big questions that one of my committee members had was, why would the mycorrhizal fungi produce this molecule that takes a lot of energy to make? And it's a fairly complex molecule, and they just exude it out into their environment. They don't just exude it out into their environment. It is on the fungal hyphae, but it also will slip off of the hyphae and get out into the surrounding environment. And so it very much challenged me, like you're talking about, in challenging the sort of paradigm into when we're talking about the microbial community, and by extension by the plants, but especially the microbial community doesn't do anything without a point. And so what I needed to do as part of my research and what I was defending was why the mycorrhizal fungi would make glomalin, why they would put it out there into the soil, and what it was doing to actually, through this aggregation, through the way it was helping with water relationships, not just water infiltration, but water retention in the soil. When you have soil that's structured with aggregates, you have more open space, you have more porosity, but that pore space is continuous, it's connected together, but it's not continuous in the same size of the pores, the same diameters of the pores, and the same pathway the pores follow is the same. So I think of it a lot of times like if you had basically designed sort of your house to have the worst plumbing system it possibly could have. But the whole idea behind that plumbing system was to keep water in certain places. So you'd come in, with maybe a 15-inch pipe, but then you would go down to, or a 15-centimeter pipe down to maybe something that would be more like a 1 centimeter, and then you would go up to a 3 centimeter, and then you'd go back down to a 0.5 centimeter, and then you'd go, so it just, the piping size would change so that water would pool in different areas and it would be maintained in that area so it doesn't evaporate off the surface. So with bare soil, the problem we run into is sort of multi-layered. Not only are we increasing the evaporative rate out of the soil, but because we're not putting photosynthetic material below ground and feeding the mycorrhizal fungi and other microbes for them to make the aggregates and stabilize the aggregates, you don't get this pore space that bends and curves and moves around the aggregates where water can be maintained. And that you're going to have greater levels of water holding capacity for a longer period of time. And so I think that it's incredibly important for us to, as we approach our agroecosystems and we approach the questions on what do, we have to be asking ourselves, what do we do from the standpoint of how is that going to affect carbon flows and energy in the system. What is it doing from that standpoint? Because it's not just about nothing. Energy isn't just used in the system with no regard to what's happening. So, when you're thinking about using cover crops or crop rotation or integrating livestock, or having more pollinators or predatory insects or whatever it is that you're wanting to put into place, how is that affecting carbon flows and the energy dynamics?
I would like to take up a bit further. So I'm very impressed, Kris, that explains a lot of your background. Now I understand you had to defend the soil physics. Because not many people from a biology point of view get the soil physics, and then the mineralogy on it gets even more complicated. But let's just jump a little bit and expand a little bit further on what you said, because I think it's important for the listeners to understand as well, is that though you talk about a series of pipes, the interesting thing about tailings dams is you've got to get the physics right before you can actually work on the chemistry. And part of getting the physics right is to do with organic matter. So a high albedo will burn plants, the underleaf of plants, because the tailings dam is very white, or if it's very black, it will have too much diurnal temperature range. But typically the problem with tailings dams is not dissimilar to that associated with bare ground, is you will have a rock mulch at the surface, which is a lot of macro porosity, or you will have a lot of fines at the surface, which is a lot of micro porosity. And effectively, a lot of mesoporosity is only created microbially. Yes, we can have some mixing material, but raindrop splash ensures that with time that you get the fines sitting at the surface. So you end up with a circumstance, if you've got a lot of micro porosity, that, and most people don't realize this, if you're dealing with fine material, you can suck water up by sunshine from 2 meters down. So you can actually completely drain your profile of water just by the action of the sun, which is why there was an encouragement right up until the late 90s to talk about, well, we need a soil mulch, is we need to get coarse clods at the surface to break that layer of suction. But the problem with that is it actually heated the soil. So you had a heat effect moving down through the soil, which then evaporated water through the heat effect. So having a standing mulch, not a lying mulch, as with a bare paddock, results in losing more water than your summer crop might be taking. Particularly water at depth. And it also means that you don't attract the winter thunderstorms or get more effective infiltration. So the relationship between, and I haven't gone into swelling clays and how you coagulate them with glomalin, but the concept of the physics and the biology is so strongly connected that a lot of what we developed of theory in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were on pure systems that excluded biology. So that science, which was component-based, not systems-based, ended up dominating the advice to farmers was, oh, we're losing all this water. And actually you're gaining water. So the concepts of the suction and what it does, and I mean, Kris, I owe you a big apology. I'm going, oh God, a soil microbiologist. What does she know? I listened to a few of your talks. I'm going, wow, she's across the physics. So it's fascinating to hear in your PhD is that you'd actually have to defend that, because when I put that graph up and a lot of soil physicists, I couldn't find a primary reference that showed that glomalin pulled it in from both the clay end and the sand end to create the mesopores. So that's, theoretically what should happen. So that graph is drawn from my experience, not from my publication. I couldn't find publication that addressed that. So I obviously didn't search hard enough, Kris. So I owe you an apology in that respect.
No apologies ever necessary. I think, again, we all learn from experience, and it is that experience to see that. And I, greatly appreciate the graph that you had and your efforts to put that together from your experience, because I think that is, again, we've locked ourselves into a lot of things. I refer to it as soil science dogma, where we say that this is the way that things are, but then you look at how the system functions and what's happening, and you see these things, talking about this porosity and plant available water, but we also know that mycorrhizal fungi and other microbes can access more water than the plant available water. They have the mechanisms not just to go into those smaller spaces and access that water, but they also have mechanisms to do that against the physical pressures that are there. So they can actually absorb water against the gradient, and utilize water in that way. And that is, again, really important to how it is that they're adapting to that environment and making sure that they're driving the entire system, working together in these relationships to make sure that the issues that are existing for the plant, because that's their primary food source, they want to make sure that that plant is happy enough to feed them, and that they're doing a job, that they have a role, that they can then earn that food from the plant. And so what we can do to help to keep those things moving forward, I think, is a really important component to things. And that goes, across the board, to water, to fertility, to soil structure. The microbes will do this in sand, they'll do this in clay, they'll do this whatever the parent material is. The microbes will be able to manipulate that parent material to their greatest advantage, so that they can get the greatest reward for the least amount of work. And that's what they're doing in making soil aggregates and creating the structure and tapping into other areas of water and nutrients.
Yeah, the greatest reward for the least amount of work is really worth pointing out. If you go back, Tamzin, to that figure, and I don't want to bang on about it, but what it's actually shown there is a thing called matrix potential, which is not directly soil suction. And the reason why I say that is matrix potential is also affected by salinity, which has the same effect on soil, increasing salinity as reducing available water. And Kris may be aware of this work, but there was a paper that came out a couple of years ago where they took alfalfa, which in Australia we call lucerne, and they dug up a series of plants that weren't legumes that grew on the edge of some of our salt lakes, so that they were haliophytes, which means they loved salt conditions in excess of TDSs of 100,000 microsiemens. So that's really, really salty conditions. So 3 times seawater. And they took the roots and shook what was on the roots. And then they put that solution to water. They took the alfalfa seeds and they just gently sprayed this water on the seeds and then planted the seeds. So they then had a series of trials where they had the lucerne treated by the haliophyte. They had salt-tolerant lucerne or alfalfa, and they had a control. And they subjected to different irrigation waters, and they ran an irrigation. Now, in Australia, we don't have particularly salt-tolerant alfalfa or lucerne. I assume it's the same in the US. It'll tolerate up to about 1,500 TDS if you're lucky, but won't go much beyond that. They watered these 3 plants at 15,000 TDS, and as my memory recalls, but anyway, it was substantively above what alfalfa would tolerate. And the plant with the haliophyte inoculation grew healthily. The others didn't even grow. And we had no idea what was the mechanism exactly, but they just took what was on the off the haliophytes and just basically washed the seed in that. And somehow, for those microbial community to survive, they had to tickle the alfalfa to do something to them, and the alfalfa to survive needed them. So when we talk about multi-species, we don't really we think multi-species animal, we think multi-species cropping, we think multi-species grazing, but we don't actually think so much about multi-species microbial inoculation.
Jump in, Kevin.
I'm just sitting back loving this. The microbiome that we create. Christine Jones, she talks about the interrelation between the soil biology and the plants and the interaction of the different microbiomes and different plants being able to pull it forward. And then, yeah, absolutely. We get the right biology in place, and magical things start happening. And when Dr. Nichols heads up to the Peace, they're in the Peace River area. That was Will Grenevald was on. When was he on? And he put things in perspective that where he farms is somewhere between Tasmania and Antarctica, if you flip Canada and put it. So when Dr. Nichols goes up to the Peace River area, that's even further north for us. So that's even closer to Antarctica. But yet they're growing things, and with the long days, we create the microbiomes. We have the microbiome within the plants. We get the local growth, and we get the local adaptation, and we bring in more biology to add to it. It's amazing. And then when you talk to Di Haggerty, and she's talking about some of the plants that are popping up in her fields that the botanists thought they were extinct, but now they're growing in their cropping land, which once again, it just, when the conditions are right and we have the biology right, plants grow. When we don't, when we mess up the soil physics, we mess up the soil chemistry, we mess up the soil biology, guess what grows? The pioneering plants. And those pioneering plants we call weeds. We get disease. This is great. I love it.
Sorry. Oh, can I just ask a question though? I just want us to think about the farming aspect with these green growing plants in the climatic phase that you're at, because it's all very well saying, we love weeds and that they're pioneer plants, but we've got a farm. And so how do we psychologically bend our minds around all the barriers that we've been indoctrinated with? So, for example, going back to that lucerne, that little square of lucerne that was green and everything else was dead around it, what was going on that farm? Why wasn't other things growing? What is this blockage that there is?
Can I, because I was just about to head in that direction. So
Okay.
Can I just take you back to the matrix potential or the plant available water graph? The problem is with traditional science is they see that as the growing zone is the top 6 inches, 150 mil at worst, the top 12 inches, say 30 centimeters. So if you can take the concept, and this is where people really, really struggle on the science side, because all our research is done on agricultural research as considered is the plough zone. And so people aren't looking at the concept. Imagine if you've not only increased in that zone, say from 17% plant available water to 80%, so roughly 40% to 80% as you sit between the clay and the organic loam. And can I get you to jump to the last two slides. The one that you understood as the chook shed. So if you could go to the second last before the chook shed, and I'll talk about the chook shed immediately. But so, yeah, if you can just go the one before that. So I had a series of slides in regard to looking at what happens with multi-species pastures, with soil, with time. So what we want to be able to do, and this is a soil we call in Australia duplex soil, and it's lost its topsoil. This was April 2017 before, and this is the best slide I've got because we didn't take lots of shots, before treatment started of a multi-species pasture system. It's typically 1,000 mil rain country, so it's about 36 inches. This year is a crook year. It's very little rainfall. It's got a dispersive B horizon, which is now expressing at the surface, or it was back then, and is through most of the cropland in Gippsland. As you've got, and this is dairies with a rye clover system growing heavily fertilized with rye, modern ryes that produce a lot of sugars and not much else. So you've got no species that produce large C to N ratios in the system. There's no fescues, there's no straws in this system. But it's supposed to be highly productive. So what you end up with is you mine from your soil the organic matter, you're fertilizing the whole time, so you're shutting your rhizosphere down. You've got a dispersive system that is massive, sets hard, very boggy. So we started, and this is a bit before my involvement, a 20 to 30 multi-species pasture system. Next slide, please. This is
sorry. Were you just okay? I'm trying to do something in the background to upload photos. Are you just? Was that interfering with you?
No. If you just go to the chook shed one.
Okay, the other way.
So this is not a chook shed. This is two backs of a ute turned side on, so you can have a look. So this is 4 years after treatment commenced. And one is a soil, so soils change along your slope. So one is a soil down towards the bottom of the slope and the other is up towards the top. But you're seeing quite a bit of organic matter development. I'm not a young person, but this soil is particularly hard to dig during summer. And last year I went out during summer with a shovel and I dug a metre down before at 8.8 of a metre, so that's roughly 28 inches. Have I got that right? Yes. So it's about 28 inches that I hit the orange, started to see the mottled clay, and I was finding worms right throughout the whole profile. Worms aren't native to Australia, but it was interesting that they'd gone down quite that depth. And I was able to dig to a metre quite readily just by hand with a shovel. So lovely aggregated material, even into the mottled zone. There was lots of roots and aggregation. So a full 36 inch, a full 40 inches metre deep, we'd seen in that 8-year period. I've only got photos from 4 years. We're going out again to do lots of soil sampling in a few months' time. So what you've got is you've now got water and mineral available at a huge depth. And this farm and a couple of others that we've been working on that have had multi-species pastures in the Gippsland area, which is, they're literally the only dairies across all of southern Victoria that haven't been feeding. So you've got a circumstance where the moisture is being taken not just at the top 6 inches to 12 inches, but the plants are collaborating with the fungi and each other. So I see it as collaborative cooperation is what we try and promote. So you have a diversity of plants that that may not provide any dry matter or value to the animal, but they're an important part of the system of pulling water from down deep and bringing it up and putting it in the shallow bit. And then some of the other plants will feed them what comes from the shallow bit, or preferentially some sugars to encourage them to go deep. So you've got a whole variety of different activities that are happening. So this is an example of not quite the same area, but this is our second example. We started 4 years ago, and this is in a low rainfall or moderate rainfall zone of 450 mil. So that's roughly 18 inches of rain under grazing. So this is a system that we use where we have occasional disturbance, and people forget, there's a single cow in the background, but on the second year system, the second year treatment there, but people forget that you can have browsers and grazers, but if you don't have scratches in your prairie system or your grazing system, you actually don't provide the right stimulation, which is an occasional acute stress for the microbes to re-establish and re-get going. You don't want major acute stress. You want a short-term shallow stress that's not universal everywhere. So this is a system that we use that puts the scratches back into the paddock. And so we have a scratching system that just impacts between 12 and 17%, but does the function of scratching by throwing a light bit of dirt over the straw, the high C to N ratio, which stimulates the saprophytic fungi. Next
Phil,
slide, please.
Can I just add to this? This is because Niels Olsen has been on this live.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah, so it's the Soil Key Renovator, people, if you're wanting to tune into what Phil is describing there, because we have seen it. And also, can I also add that pit that you were digging a meter down, Tim Thompson recorded that, didn't he? It's on his
he did.
YouTube channel. So
I wasn't too sure about whether you wanted me to cross promote anyone, so I was very careful.
Absolutely, Phil. I'm cool with that. Thank you, though, for refraining. So yeah, I'll put these links in the comment section below, or the description for all our viewers who are listening.
Okay, and just briefly, there was an experiment done over in Western Australia, in suburban Western Australia, where they isolated. This is what put me on to how effective, or what the Olsen system or the Soil Key is doing, is that they isolated a paddock from foxes and wild cats, which are a problem for our small mammals. Then after 5 or 6 years, they took the center of that area and put a small section they isolated from the small mammals. The mammals had come back quite successfully. And they found that small area grew way less successfully in its shrubs and grasses than the area in which the small mammals were in, the scratches. So we've taken scratches out of our agricultural system, and some people put them back in with chooks, with multi-species animals. But this particular, the Soil Key, takes the function of not just reseeding the paddock, but the beauty of the Soil Key is it puts scratches in. And unlike when you add compost and compost teas in, we're certainly adding microbes. When you put compost on, you at secondary degraders. You're not at primary degrader stage because the C to N ratio is already dropped. So what scratches do is they encourage the primary saprophytic degraders, your wood rot species, and they have a very important role in agricultural systems that people haven't fully explored yet. This particular shot is no pasture treatment, but hydrology treatment. So this is yesterday's shots up at Kilmore, which is in the middle of Victorian drought at the moment. So it's literally only had 2 storms since January and nothing else. So it's had no more than 100 mil. And because we're coming out of winter, it's been quite cold, and you can see there's not a lot of growth associated with the no soil key treatment. Next shot, please. So this just gives you some idea that this is the 2-year treatment system. It's running 5 kilos per metre squared in a 24-hour period when it's grazed. The Olsen's property is now doing 12.5 kilograms of cattle per metre squared in a 24-hour period. This is a pasture. It's not showing it quite well because this is literally, we've only probably had in Kilmore 5 or 6 days over a nighttime minimum of 8 degrees. So you're at the early stages of growth, and they've got growth where every other farm in the district hasn't. So they've probably had 3 weeks of growth come on post-winter. The animals are a bit lean, but that's because they've not been fed, except where what he calls bale grazing, which is to actually lift the soil up over the basalt rocks. So in this instance, we're dealing with minimal feed, no fertilizer, 2 years of multi-species pasture treatment with single spring sowing. That's it. So it has been annually replanted because it's intensive grazing for a dairy. So that gives you some idea of just in an agricultural system where we're looking at simulating multi-species animals, so looking at browsers, grazers, and by machinery scratchers, and then looking at reseeding a diverse species that's both mostly annuals, but annuals and perennials, or at least biannual, and have a situation where we've got enough diversity of which only 3 or 4 grasses are directly targeted at feeding the animal. The rest is actually about feeding the system. And I'm hand back to everyone else. My apologies for taking a bit of a journey.
You don't need to keep apologising. What I would say, though, is we are an hour and a half. How is everybody? Like, I'm sure Kevin and I could sit here for another, 6 hours. But how are you?
When you're as dumb as me, I can keep I keep absorbing. That's easy.
Yeah, me too. How are you going, Kris, with your time?
I'm fine. If you wanted to pull up, I think one of the pictures that I sent to you just recently.
Yeah, with the seeds. Yeah, you guys will have to talk while I'm doing it because as you can see, it changes the screen.
Yes, sorry about this. But I think that it's a very good point that you're making in how it is that we want to go about doing this, and you sort of brought up kind of the question of how do we move to these systems and what are we going to be able to do. And we've talked a lot about getting something green and growing and all of these things, but part of it comes for me with kind of that mindset that we need to be thinking about what we're actually getting from having something green and growing, because that becomes the biggest question that you have as a farmer or rancher is, how does this work for me economically? And when we're trying to plant cover crops or we're allowing weeds or volunteer plants to grow, and we talked about the fact that in our minds we think that that's stealing more from our cash crop or a forage crop than it may actually be gaining. But I think that what it is that we're really trying to do, I think of it as a carbon bank account. And that what you've got is you have all of these accounts in your banking system because it really is a carbon economy. This is how we're paying for all of these resources. And if you can't get the photo, that's fine. But
I have
trying
now.
to talk about how it is. I think the one where you can really see I think it's just one plant there, and you can really see the roots coming out from the straw.
Let me see this one. Okay, yeah. Oh, it's still uploading. Sorry, continue. Okay, well, I'll keep it on this one, and it should upload eventually.
Yeah. Hopefully, yeah. But talking about the bank account, and so this sort of illustrates some of this, again, at a time of the year in which we wouldn't have expected to see any plants that are growing. We have a plant that's growing, and some of the biggest questions we have all the time, or I get all the time, about planting cover crops or allowing, volunteers or weeds to grow, all of those types of things. And Kevin, I'm sure you get those same questions, is, well, if it's only going to grow like you see here, where it's barely above the soil and you don't even see much of the shoot that's there, is that really being effective? But what you can see here, and this is the important point of this in this carbon bank, is what's happening below ground. So again, what it is that we're not seeing. First off, that you're getting a seed that's germinating in mid-February in Alberta, but not just the seed that's germinating and using that insulation by growing through the straw, growing through the residue that's there, but you see all of the root mass that's coming out and the Ryzo sheaths and all of the carbon that's coming out of those roots. That is where we're basically, what's happening with photosynthesis to me is that process above ground is sort of like a checking account that's constantly putting money in and money's going out through the checking account. But part of what's in the checking account needs to go not just to savings, but also to sort of a long-term retirement account. And so what we're trying to do here is, again, even if you don't see a whole lot growing above ground, when you get this happening below ground, that checking account above ground is feeding into everything that's happening below ground. So you really see the Ryzo sheets on here. It's putting that money into the savings account and putting some of that carbon, some of that money and those resources into the long-term retirement account. And you want to build all of these accounts simultaneously through this process. And that's the big value that you're getting as a farmer or a rancher, where you're actually putting this carbon here. And so we oftentimes think about the fact that, well, if it's only going to be growing for, a couple of weeks, or if my shoot is only going to be about 5 centimeters high, what is the value of that to me? This is the value of this to you. You've now been putting money into carbon, into your savings account and into your long-term retirement account. So you have those funds available. And those funds are available to be able to move around and utilize this to buy fertility and buy water throughout the growing season. It also is something that we so often, I think, humanize the way that we look at plants. And plants are not human beings. They don't feel temperature in the same way that we do. They don't respond to their environment in the same way that we do. It doesn't mean that they don't have to have the formation of biomolecules and structures to respond to that environment. But if we were allowing them the options and opportunities to grow in times of the year which we wouldn't expect, whether it's too hot or too cold, they're still going to do photosynthesis and they're still going to be moving carbon below ground. So they're doing this for their desire to put that carbon into the savings account and into the long-term retirement account, so that throughout the growing season, they can invest and take money out of those accounts and use that to pay for water and nutrients and the building of the soil structure so that they can have greater levels of porosity so that the roots have a good growing environment. It's all adding on top of each other in a very positive way. And so when we ask ourselves these questions of what should we do or why are we doing this, we're doing this so that we have resiliency, so that we have redundancy of function, which allows the system to function under a variety of different conditions, whether it's, under very salty conditions or very wet conditions or very dry conditions, very hot, very cold. There is microbes that are going to be active at all of those times. We've done research studies where we've shown that we can have microbial activity at minus 20 degrees Celsius in soil. And so that will allow us to be able, I think, to start understanding and looking beyond just these stories that we've told ourselves there are times of the year when the soil is dead and not active and nothing is functioning. There's only so much that I can do. If I grow it just this high, is that really providing me a benefit? All of these questions that we're asking are actually going to help us to really want to tap into these efficiencies that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to address all of these issues in the changing environment over that time. So whether it's, man-made climate change that we have going on now, which we're changing the environment faster than a natural system will change the environment, but the environment has always been changing. And the microbes have had to figure out how to exist in that changing environment. We just want to figure out how it is that we can help to tap into accelerating those processes.
And how we can get out of the way and stop hindering the system.
Yes, and how we can get out of the way and stop hindering the system. And asking ourselves the right questions. I mean, going back to what I was saying about having to defend this, we have to defend the actions that we're doing. I had to defend why the mycorrhizal fungi did what they did. We all have to defend these things from that carbon economy standpoint.
I would potentially like to expand the carbon economy, which is important in the soil, but also pick up the water economy in the landscape. And the two are tied together. And if you were to go to slide 5 for me, Tamzin. But I'd also like to just, as Tamzin's finding that, just briefly talk in regard to the chemistry. Not too sure. So, so the one after that. So what we found is it starts with the biology. Kris, you and I are absolutely in massive agreement there. But I see it as a series of circles, is that you need the right root environment and to satisfy its relationship with bacteria and fungi, but then you need the bacteria to feed the free living fungi for a functionality, which I'll just talk about in a sec. So here you've seen great aggregation, you've got great root hairs, and that feeds back to the root. So that is your biome, but your biome, that's your micrological diversity, but it actually got to react with the mineral chemistry, particularly if you're looking at those systems we just talked about. If you completely cut fertilizer out, which we have done, you've got two different responses in the US and in Australia, typically, in gross generalization. So you can have legumes that the leaves go purple because they're just lacking phosphate, but don't add it. And the next year, they'll pop up again. You've got to do this paddock by paddock. You can't do it all once. It'll pop up, and it'll be less purple. And by the third year, if you haven't come in with inoculation, there's a way to get this down to 1 year. It's as healthy as can be. And that's no phosphate in a iron-dominated system, because the root has stimulated the bacteria to go and stimulate what is a fungi that produces acid to crack the rock and break the appetite to bring back to the plant. So you're dealing with a mineral chemistry interaction where the fungi have got to know, what to produce for the plant. And in Australia, it's phosphate. In the US, you actually have an illite-dominated soil, and mostly it's a wind-blown aeolian. It's much better soil than Australia. But because it's illite-dominated, it loves potassium. It's got lots of potassium on it, but it always wants more. So whatever potassium you put out gets rapidly sorbed and stuck to this illite. But a fungi producing acid, a very localized level, can dissolve a little bit of that clay and put a proton in and open this clay. And clay's like a stack of paper. So you can open a sheet, shove in a proton and pull off some potassium. But only a bit of acid can do that, very localized, and only fungi can deliver it. And it takes a year or two, unless you inoculate, that relationship to build up. So you can actually not have to worry about potassium fertilizer in the US anymore, or phosphate where you have parent material. Australia's a little different Western Australia is we don't actually have parent material close to the surface. So we do have to get around that phosphate problem. Then you step out one more level. If you've got a healthy biome, it can hold more water. It changes the heat relationship. So you have vegetation in your landscape, particularly tree belts whose function is to cause turbulence. So healthy soil with some tree belts across the landscape reduces substantively the sensible heat. So you get lots of evapotranspiration and you get turbulence by the trees. So you actually change your climate by getting more rainfall. So these are the circles that occur right from having a carbon bank. But if you also got to look at the landscape to ensure that you have a water bank, that you're storing water in your alluvium, which is a whole nother discussion, and you're managing your mid-slope to make sure that you don't actually get mid-slope springs that aren't strata-based occurring, because they can have losses of production and salinity and bogging and the like. So there are more than just carbon. There are other aspects across the landscape that can help your water and your carbon. So that's how I like to look at it, as a series of circles that actually just comes from the Rhizosphere Association.
I was muted. I'm just loving this discussion. It's not often actually that I have a Sunday session where I have to mute myself. Wow. Okay, so shall we wrap it up? Shall we give our little conclusions of the changing climate that we feel that we're in?
And invite them back again, because
absolutely, part
there's
two.
a bunch of gold here that people are going to love.
Yeah, I was thinking that this really should be part 1, 2, 3. Actually, we could make a whole series.
Well, it's a pleasure to accompany Kris and Kevin in a panel session. In fact, one of my greatest learnings comes from Minnesota, from a guy called Ed Natter, who Kris may well know, who was the lecturer of soil science and agricultural systems at Minnesota. Ed is one of the genuine few people who's very open to lots of viewpoints. And he's very open to going onto a farm, and a farmer says, I saw this, and he doesn't go, oh, it's not possible. He goes, oh, that's fantastic. Show me how, or show me where. I think Ed's retired now, but he spoke about which, and this was 2008 or 2009 when I was visiting Ed. And at the time he said, Phil, I just got back from doing a farm inspection. And the US has an unusual system in that everything in the US is capitalist except farming, which has an insurance support system associated with 5 crops. And one of the farmers was on a quite large US farm. It was about 1,800 acres, cropping just a little bit out of Minnesota. And the farmer said, he's going to have to rely on the insurance scheme this year because he won't be making any income. And he literally went next door to 120 acre. You do things in sections in the US and Canada, so it would have been a quarter section, I think. Would that be right? 120 acres? Anyway, so it wasn't a full section anyway. It was much smaller. It was about 1/8 of a typical, double section or a single section farm. And he was a Mennonite. Anyway, he was one of those religious communities that have no mechanical devices on the land, and wear clothes of the 18th century and so forth. And he had a 4-horse ploughing system, and you can plough an acre a day a horse. So that means he could do 4 acres a day. The useless things I collect. Anyway, so he had this 4-horse ploughing system, and of course his input costs are zero because they have a barn raising day, so where all the community come along and build a barn for a newlyweds, etc. So the labour costs associated with external things such as those are minimal. The tractor, i.e. the horses to pull the ploughs, are fed with the grain. All the produce comes from the farm. It's diverse, etc. This farmer was whinging because he had to pay the top tax rate. So this farm was so regenerative, it had no inputs, and he was making a huge amount of profit. Yes, he had lots of diversity, and yes, he got more because he sold not just organic, but he sold a product that a lot of people desire for the nutrient quality of what it was about. But they were in the top tax bracket on 1/8 of the land compared to the neighbour who was basically farming for Big Pharma and had, obviously more crop, but less produce per acre, which is, and more money. So that what taught me that the biological farming system, and they have a philosophy that obviously doesn't suit most farmers. It certainly wouldn't suit me. But there's a lot you can learn from biodynamics and from alternate systems that actually work, and to go and study why they work. And it was Ed, a fellow Minnesotan, who actually taught me that, Kris.
And if people want to catch, well, at least in the United States, Phil, you're coming to No Till in the Plains in January?
Yes.
Because who wouldn't love to come to Kansas in January? It's beautiful that time of year.
Yeah, I've been across in January in a snowstorm before, so I kind of know what I'm going for.
And for us Canadians, we're going to be blessed with having Kris come up to northern Alberta. What other travel plans do you have in the next little while?
Well, for me, I'm going to be actually at the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition conference in Mankato and at the National No-Till Conference in January in St. Louis, and at the Direct Seed Association in the Pacific Northwest in Kennewick, Washington in January of 2026 as well. So just really great to be able to share this time with all of you and Phil and Kevin as always. But Phil, nice to be meeting you for the first time, but really being able to hear about what you've been doing and what you have learned. I think that for me as a research scientist, the most important thing for me is to always try to get back to the land and go and visit farms and ranches and have these opportunities that you have, where a lot of my life in regenerative agriculture, I say, started when I would go on to a ranch, and the rancher would ask a bunch of questions, and I didn't know the answers to those questions, but it drove me to have to go back and start searching through research and searching through studies and trying to figure out what's going on as we look at these very complex systems, and digging holes and looking at what's happening in the soil, and really being able to try and see these things that we normally don't see in our environment, but are so important. Just to follow up on one of the ending points that Phil was making, we can basically have more than 9,000 different interactions going on with different microbes simultaneously. And that's really trying to help to address all of these issues that it is that we are seeing on the landscape. And so whether you're in Canada, these pictures were kind of part of my life too in different places. So Canada, in Pennsylvania, in North Dakota, in Minnesota, in Western Australia, in Queensland, wherever it is that you are, soil is universal. And the organisms that we can't see were the ones that helped to actually create soil. We didn't have soil without microbes and without photosynthesis, and we can't regenerate soil without microbes and without photosynthesis. So how we can tap into those things and what we can continue to learn from their activities just continues to excite me every day. So I'm very honored to be with you all and have learned from you all over the last couple of hours, and we'll continue to learn and share as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kris. And I'm kind of speechless in a way. It's I'm so glad that you two have had a chance to discuss together, Kris and Phil, and then of course combine it with the multi-species farming with Kevin. And wow, my learning just went. Actually, I'll show you where it went. It went up there. Look.
Well, thank you for asking me, Tamzin, and Kris and Kevin. I've admired your work from afar and the odd video I've come across. You're both reasonably well known across the world in regard to, I don't so much see it as regenerative, but the necessary work that needs to be done in science education and communicating the alternate systems to the more on, as in put more fertilizer on, systems that currently exist. So it has been a pleasure to meet you both.
Oh, I'm like I said, I'm just in awe with the two of you, and then Tamzin, her energy that keeps things going. So thank you very much for keeping my education moving forward.
So I'm just thanking everybody for tuning in today, because it has just, well, by the time we sign off, it will be a 2-hour mark. So this is something that we haven't done before, but wow, what information. And we've only really half covered everything, haven't we? So I will actually put this one up. This is from Christine Smith. Is Phil available to come back and talk about clouds?
My family, when we go anywhere, we have a Viber album called Cloud Porn, because we take these photos as we drive everywhere. So I'm not a cloud expert. I'm how it forms and what happens and how it impacts the landscape. I'm so happy to talk about clouds, but I'm not. I can talk about interactions with landscape more than I can be a great expert on clouds. But yeah, farm climate interactions, landscape is where my soil science has forced me to go.
Okay, well, I'll have to find a cloud man then, won't I? I do have one already in my head, so we'll see if he wants to come on. Okay, thank you to everybody. Thank you for watching.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for your input, and good luck with all of your other, what do you call them, field days and workshops and conferences. We will all be tuning in because we are all one. This little planet is, or big planet is very small with the whole social media, and we can tune in whenever we like. So anyway, we're going to sign off. Thank you so much for the Sunday session today on water, carbon cycles and multi-species farming. Thank you, everybody.